The United States has a long history of anti-Asian racism, but over the past year, the problem has been getting worse. It's also compounded by the economic damage from the pandemic, with many Asian American employees and business people missing out on main sources of relief. In response to all those concerns, organizations in Boston have set up the Asian Community Emergency Relief Fund. Our guest is from one of those organizations, the executive director of the Asian Community Development Corporation, Angie Liou. Thank you very much for being with us, Angie.
Thank you, Chris, for having me on the show.
Angie, talk about the difference between the long history and what has happened in the past year or so.
Sure. I think many members of the Asian community, particularly low-income immigrants, had already been facing a lot of challenges even before 2020. We know that residents in Chinatown, as well as people in Fields Corner, had already been facing a lot of gentrification pressures. So when the pandemic hit, with unemployment skyrocketing, that just really layered on the difficulties people were facing in terms of ability to pay rent and maintain their housing, ability to get basic needs like food and medical care, which is why my organization, ACDC, along with five other area Asian American serving organizations, decided that we had to start an emergency fund just to get direct assistance to members in our community who did not qualify for unemployment or other public benefits because of their immigration status or other issues.
Well, when I picture some of the businesses that have been hit really hard, places on Dorchester Avenue that depend on walk-in customers. They could be restaurants, nail salons, or even hair salons. What's going on in the minds of employees? And I think the apprehensions that they have to live with as well.
Absolutely. I think early on in the pandemic, there was this struggle, right? People were very fearful about going to work, and we know that not all employers were equal in providing adequate PPE to their workers, right? So people had to make this choice, um, even if they had to work hours of between going to work and risking their own health and their family's health, and bring home a paycheck. And that's for people who still had work hours. Many people lost their work completely and did not have enough work. And this also exposes the underlying weakness of our economic system, which is many of these employees, they're low-wage workers. They do not have things like paid sick hours. So it's really a hard choice between going to work, but risking your health.
At the recent town hall on anti-Asian racism, there was an account about a nail salon worker who was an undocumented immigrant and what she was struggling with. And one of the things that really got my attention in a way was at some of these salons, they keep the doors locked until they actually see someone approaching who has an appointment. These people want business. So why is it that they have to keep the doors locked? What's going on in their minds?
I obviously can't speak to that woman's mindset, but I would imagine just from anecdotes that my organization and our partner organizations have heard throughout the pandemic is that there has been increased instances of verbal and physical abuse against Asians or people who look like Asians since the pandemic. I do want to emphasize that anti-Asian sentiment is not new in this country. However, since the beginning of the pandemic last year, the former administration's fanning of the flames did not help. And that contributed to a heightened sense, even to this day, of an atmosphere of fear among our communities.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you've been trying to do with the fund, the emergency relief fund, and how well that's going at this point?
Sure. The organizations came together in March last year, shortly after the state shutdown began, because we immediately realized that with the shutdown, that was going to disproportionately affect our community, many of whom work in the industries that really had to be in person, right? So that's restaurant workers, food service, hospitality, home healthcare aides. So we put together the fund really quickly, launched it, and over the course of about 6 months, we collectively raised over $350,000 from primarily private sources. And we distributed that in the form of direct aid, in other words, gift cards to families. The way we got them to people was we had 4 in-language phone lines set up in Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Khmer, so that people needing assistance could call those lines and get the help they need in their own language. And so, over half of the fund went to families that were undocumented or had undocumented members.
I want to ask you about how the climate of racism overlaps with housing, because there is a long history of displacement in Chinatown, because of the market values, if for no other reason. But we're also hearing more recently about those pressures in Dorchester. What's happening?
I think there's a long history of displacement in communities of color, just because those historically tend to be the ones that have the least political power. So, with the history of eminent domain in the 20th century in American cities, is that that tends to happen in communities of color that did not have the power to resist. Not that they just accepted a wholesale, they certainly tried to resist what was happening to them, but because they did not have the political power to do so, they lost their neighborhoods and were displaced. We saw that in Chinatown in the 50s and 60s. And even though Chinatown has grown a lot in political power as well as representation, I would say over the last 20, 30 years, we still see the effects of gentrification and displacement being extremely powerful. And I think as Boston continues to grow, even though the pandemic has slowed that down some, developers are looking for places to develop. And Dorchester is one of those neighborhoods that is also experiencing great pressures of gentrification. And so in these neighborhoods, it's Chinese, Vietnamese, but also, Black and Latinx residents who are feeling that immense pressure of displacement.
What you also see in history, at least in Chinatown, is that when people struggled against displacement, whether it was gentrification or institutional expansion, there was also a crossing of racial lines to build alliances. What's the lesson for that going forward?
Chris, I'm really glad you brought that up, because since the reckoning with the racial injustice in this country last summer in the wake of George Floyd's murder, as well as now, many people in our community are talking about, what do we do? How do we respond and move forward in the wake of rising anti-Asian hate? And I really think it's not possible to do this work, to have solutions, if there is not cross-racial cooperation working together. Some of the media portrayal of the incidents have focused more on interracial conflict. And I think that misses the point. It's really important for our communities to realize that there is actually a common denominator, which is the white supremacy that's so embedded in this country since its founding. So it's really about tackling the common problems of systemic racism. So even though a lot of news coverage have covered individual acts of violence, and those are absolutely horrific, but I think people tend to gloss over the underlying systemic racism that our communities face as a common denominator. So, for example, gentrification displacement, right? That is not something that only Chinese residents or only Vietnamese residents face. We have commonalities with Black and Latinx residents as well in the South End and Roxbury and Dorchester. And so those are issues that are cross-racial, and our local communities have a history of working together to try to bring about systemic change on those issues.
Finally, Angie, if people want to get some more information, either about the relief fund or some of the changes to combat systemic racism that your organization is supporting, where can they find some of that?
Sure. The best way is to go to the APIs Can Facebook page. So APIs Can is the Asian Pacific Islander Civic Action Network of Massachusetts, which my organization belongs to, and many of the other community grassroots organizations also belong to. The APIs Can Facebook not only has a recording of last Thursday's town hall on anti-Asian racism, but it also has a link to a great list of resources that we have compiled together, including books and articles to read, documentaries to watch, as well as where to donate. And that also includes the link to the Asian Community Emergency Relief Fund.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
This is Angie Liou from the Asian Community Development Corporation. We'll have more news in just a moment.